The year is 1789. France stands on the precipice of revolution. In the gilded halls of Versailles, a queen sits imprisoned by her own privilege, her name whispered with venom through the streets of Paris. Marie Antoinette, Dauphine, queen, mother, scapegoat. History remembers her draped in diamonds and disdain, a woman so detached from reality that when told her people had no bread, she allegedly replied with callous indifference, "Let them eat cake." But here, in this moment, we must pause. We must ask ourselves a question that echoes across 2.5 centuries. Did she ever say it? And if she didn't, why does the world believe she did? This is not merely the story of a misquote. This is the story of how legends are born, how propaganda shapes history, how a single phrase can define a woman, a monarchy, and a revolution that changed the world forever. To understand this phantom utterance, these 4 words that Marie Antoinette never spoke, we must journey back through time itself. We must understand the France she was born into, the Austria that shaped her, the political machinery that moved her like a chess piece across Europe, and the revolutionary fires that consumed her. We must excavate the layers of myth, the centuries of storytelling, the deliberate constructions and accidental distortions that turned a flesh and blood woman into a symbol of aristocratic excess. Our story begins not in France, but in the heart of the Habsburg Empire, in a palace where empires were forged and dynasties intertwined. It begins with a girl who never asked to be queen. Vienna, 1755. The Hofburg Palace rises like a monument to imperial power, its Baroque facades gleaming in the autumn light. Within these walls, on the 2nd day of November, a child enters the world who will become one of history's most misunderstood figures. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis, the first, Holy Roman Emperor. She arrives into a world already shaped by forces beyond her comprehension, into a family where children are not merely loved but deployed, where every marriage is a treaty and every smile a diplomatic gesture. Her mother, Maria Theresa, stands as one of Europe's most formidable rulers. When her father Charles VI died in 1740, leaving no male heir, the vultures of Europe circled. The War of Austrian Succession erupted, Prussia, France, Bavaria, all seeking to tear apart the Habsburg domains, all convinced that a woman could not hold together an empire. They were wrong. Maria Theresa fought with a ferocity that stunned Europe. She rode to the Hungarian Diet, her infant son in her arms, and rallied the Hungarian nobles to her cause with a speech so powerful that grown men wept and pledged their swords. She secured her throne through brilliance, determination, and an iron will wrapped in silk gloves. This is the woman who shapes young Maria Antonia's early years. But the Empress has little time for maternal tenderness. She rules an empire that stretches from the Austrian heartland to the distant reaches of Hungary, Bohemia, and beyond. She modernizes her administration, reforms her military, establishes schools, and centralizes power with an efficiency that would make future bureaucrats weep with admiration. Her days begin before dawn and end long after darkness falls. Her children see her at formal dinners, at state occasions, surrounded always by ministers and advisers and the crushing weight of imperial responsibility. Young Maria Antonia grows up in the shadow of greatness, the youngest daughter in a sprawling family where older siblings disappear into marriages across Europe. Her sister Maria Carolina will go to Naples. Her sister Maria Amalia will go to Parma. Each daughter is a diplomatic offering, a living treaty, a bridge between dynasties. Maria Antonia understands, even as a child, that she too will be sent somewhere someday to marry someone chosen not by her heart, but by reason of state. Her education reflects this destiny. She learns to dance, the minuet, the allemande, the courtly steps that will make her graceful in any ballroom in Europe. She learns music, her small fingers picking out melodies on the harpsichord and harp, her voice trained for the salons where queens must entertain. She learns languages, though her German remains dominant, and her French will forever carry the soft accent of her Austrian homeland. She learns deportment, how to enter a room, how to curtsy, how to hold herself with the bearing of royalty. But crucially, devastatingly, she does not learn statecraft. She does not learn politics. She does not learn the dangerous game of court intrigue that will one day consume her. Instead, she remains a child, playful, affectionate, somewhat frivolous. Her tutors despair at her lack of interest in serious subjects. She would rather run through the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace than study history. She would rather play with her dogs than learn diplomatic protocol. Her mother notes this with concern. Maria Theresa is many things: ruler, reformer, mother, but she is also a pragmatist. She loves her daughter, but she loves her empire more, and she knows that Maria Antonia's destiny lies not in Vienna but in France. The idea begins to take shape in the early 1760s. For centuries, France and Austria have been enemies, their rivalry stretching back through the wars of Spanish succession, the 30 Years' War, through generations of bloodshed and betrayal. But the world is changing. A new power rises in the East, Prussia, aggressive and militaristic under Frederick the Great, that philosopher king who speaks French, plays the flute, and conquers territories with ruthless efficiency. Austria needs allies. France needs allies. And so, in the calculated world of 18th century diplomacy, ancient enemies become friends. This diplomatic revolution, engineered by Austria's brilliant Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, requires cementing. Treaties are written on parchment, but alliances are sealed in blood, specifically in the blood of royal marriages. Maria Theresa understands this perfectly. She has married daughters to princes across Europe. Now she will marry her youngest daughter to the most prestigious throne of all, France. The French Dauphin Louis Auguste, grandson of King Louis XV, needs a wife. He is an awkward boy, thick-bodied and myopic, more interested in larks and metalwork than courtly pleasures, but he will one day be King of France, ruler of the most populous, wealthy, and culturally dominant nation in Europe. Maria Theresa sees opportunity. Her ministers begin negotiations. Letters cross the Alps. Portraits are exchanged. The young Dauphin painted in his finest clothes, Maria Antonia captured by the court painter in a pose of youthful innocence. For Maria Antonia, now 13 years old, the news arrives like a thunderbolt. She will leave Vienna. She will leave her mother, her siblings, her dogs, the gardens she has played in since childhood. She will travel to a foreign country where they speak a language she barely knows, where the customs are different, where she knows no one. She will marry a boy she has never met. And she will do this because empires require it, because her mother commands it, because this is what Habsburg daughters do. The preparations begin immediately. Her education intensifies. French tutors arrive to polish her language, though time is short, and her accent remains stubbornly Austrian. She is tutored in French history, in the genealogies of the Bourbon dynasty, in the complex etiquette of Versailles. A court so elaborate, so ritualized, that it makes Vienna seem provincial by comparison. She is given new clothes, new jewels, everything designed to transform her from an Austrian archduchess into a French Dauphine. Her hair is dressed higher. Her gowns become more elaborate. Even her name is Gallicized. Maria Antonia becomes Marie Antoinette. On April 19, 1770, she leaves Vienna forever. The procession is magnificent. Dozens of carriages, hundreds of attendants, all the pageantry that two great empires can muster. Maria Theresa embraces her daughter one final time, and witnesses say the Empress weeps. This woman who faced down armies, who defied all of Europe, weeps at losing her youngest child. She gives Marie Antoinette a letter of instructions, advice for navigating the treacherous waters of Versailles. She tells her daughter to be obedient to her husband, to win the love of the French people, to never forget that she represents Austria. Then the carriages roll forward, and Maria Antonia, now Marie Antoinette, begins the journey toward her destiny. The path takes them through Bavaria, through the German principalities, toward the French border. Everywhere, crowds gather to see the young archduchess who will be France's next queen. She waves from carriage windows, her smile bright, her manner charming. She is 14 years old, and she has no idea what awaits her. At the French border, a ceremony of surreal formality takes place. On an island in the Rhine, a wooden pavilion has been constructed, divided precisely down the middle. One half is Austrian territory, one half is French. Marie Antoinette enters from the Austrian side, accompanied by her Austrian ladies. In a ritual of almost violent symbolism, she is stripped of everything Austrian, her clothes, her jewels, even her undergarments. She stands naked in this liminal space, neither Austrian nor French, and then she is dressed again in French garments, every stitch French, every piece transforming her into something new. Her Austrian ladies withdraw. French ladies advance. And when Marie Antoinette walks out the French side of that pavilion, Maria Antonia has ceased to exist. The journey to Versailles continues through France. The cities and towns turn out to greet their new Dauphine, Strasbourg, Nancy, Chalons. She charms them with her youth and beauty, her graceful manner, her genuine warmth. The French people, seeing her for the first time, adore her. She represents hope, youth, the promise of renewal for a monarchy grown stale. King Louis XV, the aging monarch known as Louis the Well-Beloved, though that title has grown increasingly ironic in his later years, waits at Versailles to receive her. And in the forest of Compiègne, she meets for the first time the boy she will marry. Louis Auguste is 15 years old, awkward and shy, his thick body uncomfortable in the elaborate court costumes he must wear. He approaches the carriage with visible nervousness. Marie Antoinette steps out, and for a moment, these two children, for that is what they are, regard each other. History does not record what they thought in that instant, but we can imagine. She sees a heavyset boy with kind eyes and uncertain manner. He sees a delicate beauty who seems impossibly sophisticated compared to his own clumsy self. They exchange formal greetings. She curtsies. He bows, and then they continue together toward Versailles. The palace rises before them like a dream-made architecture. Louis XIV monument to absolute monarchy, a structure so vast it houses 10,000 people, its gardens stretching to the horizon, its hall of mirrors a gallery of light and luxury that stuns even those accustomed to wealth. This will be Marie Antoinette's home, her prison, and eventually her nightmare. But in May of 1770, as she rides through those golden gates, she sees only wonder. Versailles in 1770 is not merely a palace. It is a machine of power, an instrument of control designed by Louis XIV to tame the French nobility and concentrate all authority in the person of the king. The architecture itself enforces hierarchy, the king's bedroom positioned at the exact center of the palace, aligned with the sunrise, every corridor and chamber radiating outward from that solar point. To live at Versailles is to live in proximity to power, and proximity is everything. The etiquette that governs life here is suffocating in its complexity. Every moment of the royal day is choreographed, ritualized, transformed into public spectacle. The lever, the king's rising, involves dozens of courtiers with precisely defined roles. The coucher, the royal bedtime, is equally elaborate. Even the act of dressing becomes ceremony. When the queen puts on her shift in the morning, the honor of handing it to her goes to the highest-ranking woman present, and if a princess of the blood arrives mid-ceremony, the shift must be passed backward through the hierarchy until it reaches the appropriate hands. These are not merely customs. They are the substance of power at Versailles, where access and honor and position are everything. Marie Antoinette enters this world as a 14-year-old girl who barely speaks the language, and she is immediately overwhelmed. On May 16, 1770, 2 days after her arrival, she marries Louis Auguste in the Chapel Royal at Versailles. The ceremony is magnificent. Thousands of candles, the greatest nobles of France in attendance, her gown so heavy with embroidered silver that she can barely walk. The Archbishop of Paris conducts the service. The Dauphine slides a ring onto her finger. They are married, these children, bound together by vows they barely understand in a partnership that will ultimately cost them both their lives. But first comes the wedding night, and here begins one of the great mysteries of their marriage. They are put to bed in the ceremonial manner, the bed blessed by the Archbishop, the young couple installed between silk sheets while courtiers look on, and then finally, blessedly, left alone. The court waits for news of consummation. The Austrian ambassador waits to report success to Maria Theresa. Everyone waits, and nothing happens. The marriage remains unconsummated for 7 years. The reasons are complex and have been debated by historians for centuries. Louis Auguste suffers from a condition, possibly phimosis, a tightening of the foreskin that makes intercourse painful or impossible, that he is too embarrassed to address. He is deeply self-conscious about his body, uncomfortable with physical intimacy, more at ease in his workshops than in bed. Marie Antoinette, for her part, knows nothing of sex beyond vague allusions and is bewildered by her husband's inability or unwillingness to consummate their union. Letters fly to Vienna. Maria Theresa sends increasingly frustrated instructions, urging her daughter to be patient, to be alluring, to do whatever necessary to secure her position by producing an heir. But Marie Antoinette is a girl playing at being a wife, and Louis Auguste is a boy who would rather tinker with locks than embrace his bride. This failure has consequences that echo through their entire story. Marie Antoinette's position at court depends on producing an heir, specifically, a male heir to secure the succession. Without children, she is vulnerable to the elaborate intrigues of Versailles, where courtiers plot and scheme and maneuver for advantage. The Dauphine's aunts, Mesdames Adélaïde, Victoire, and Sophie, the unmarried daughters of Louis XV, see in Marie Antoinette a foreign interloper who threatens their influence over their nephew. They watch her with suspicious eyes. They whisper to Louis Auguste about his wife's flightiness, her Austrian connections, her unsuitability, and then there is Madame du Barry. Jean Bécu, the king's mistress, holds enormous influence over Louis XV in his final years. She is beautiful, Carmen-born, and utterly confident in her sexuality, everything that Marie Antoinette is not. Court protocol demands that Marie Antoinette acknowledge the king's mistress, but the young Dauphine, urged on by the king's aunts and her own sense of propriety, refuses to speak to Du Barry. This becomes a cause célèbre at Versailles. Will the Dauphine relent? Will she acknowledge the favorite? The entire court watches this battle of wills between a teenage archduchess and a courtesan 20 years her senior. Marie Antoinette holds out for months, and in Vienna, Maria Theresa tears her hair out in frustration. Letters arrive at Versailles written in the Empress's own hand, ordering her daughter to end this ridiculous feud, to speak to Du Barry, to stop making enemies when her position is still so precarious. Finally, at a card party on New Year's Day 1772, Marie Antoinette approaches Madame Du Barry and utters a single sentence: "There are many people at Versailles today." It is the absolute minimum required by etiquette, an acknowledgement so minimal it barely counts, but it ends the immediate crisis. Du Barry accepts the olive branch. The court breathes a collective sigh. And Marie Antoinette has learned an important lesson at Versailles. Pride is a luxury she cannot afford, but pride is precisely what she has in abundance, along with youth, beauty, and a desperate desire to matter in a world where she feels increasingly powerless. Her husband ignores her. The court gossips about her. Her mother sends letters filled with criticism and disappointed expectations. And so Marie Antoinette does what many young people do when overwhelmed. She escapes into pleasure. The years from 1770 to 1774 see the young Dauphine transform from an anxious girl into the acknowledged leader of Versailles fashion and frivolity. She surrounds herself with young nobles who share her love of entertainment. She attends the opera in Paris, sometimes multiple times per week, despite this being somewhat scandalous for a Dauphine. She gambles at cards, winning and losing thousands of livres in a single night. She stays up until dawn at balls and masquerades, sleeping through the morning and emerging only in the afternoon. She shops obsessively, ordering gowns and shoes and jewels from the merchants who flock to supply her inexhaustible appetite for luxury. Her closest friend in these years is the Princess de Lamballe, a young widow of exquisite sensitivity and unshakable devotion. Marie Antoinette revives for her the position of superintendent of the Queen's household, a title that comes with an enormous salary and gives Lamballe direct access to the Dauphine's inner circle. Together, they create a little world within Versailles, a bubble of youth and gaiety that tries desperately to ignore the weight of expectation that presses down upon them. And then everything changes. In May 1774, King Louis XV falls ill at the Grand Trianon, one of the pleasure palaces in the Versailles grounds. The symptoms are unmistakable: fever, headache, and then the telltale pustules erupting across his skin. Smallpox, that great leveler, that disease that respects no rank or privilege. The king is moved to Versailles, to his bedchamber at the center of the palace, and there, over the course of 10 days, one of the longest reigns in French history comes to an agonizing end. His body becomes a mass of suppurating lesions. The smell becomes unbearable. His daughters nurse him with admirable courage, and Madame Du Barry is banished from court. The dying king cannot receive the sacraments while living in sin. On May 10, 1774, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Louis XV dies. The moment his death is announced, a sound like thunder rolls through Versailles. It is the sound of hundreds of courtiers running, literally running, through the galleries and corridors, all racing to the apartments of the new king and queen. Because Louis Auguste, that awkward 19-year-old boy who prefers locksmithing to statecraft, is now Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre, and Marie Antoinette, just 18 years old, is now Queen of France, the most powerful woman in Europe, consort to a throne that commands 25 million subjects and sits at the center of European affairs. When the courtiers burst into their apartments, they find the king and queen kneeling together in prayer. Marie Antoinette is weeping. Later, she will tell friends that in that moment, she felt not joy but terror. "God guide us and protect us," Louis XVI reportedly says. "We are too young to reign." He is right to be afraid. The weight now resting on their young shoulders is almost inconceivable, and neither of them has been properly prepared to bear it. The France over which Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette now rule is a nation of contradictions, a country simultaneously brilliant and broken, wealthy and bankrupt, enlightened and feudal. To understand the tragedy that will unfold, we must understand this France, not as revolutionary propaganda later painted it, but as it actually was in 1774, complex and troubled and teetering on the edge of transformation. France in the late 18th century is the most populous nation in Europe. 25 to 28 million people, compared to perhaps 8 million in England and 5 million in Prussia. Paris is the cultural capital of the Western world, its salons and academies setting the tone for art, literature, philosophy, and fashion across the continent. French is the language of diplomacy, spoken in every court from Madrid to St. Petersburg. French architects design palaces for foreign monarchs. French chefs define haute cuisine. French philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Diderot, are reshaping how people think about government, society, religion, and human nature itself. But beneath this glittering surface, profound problems fester. France's government is an absolutist monarchy, power theoretically concentrated entirely in the person of the king, who rules by divine right and answers to God alone. In practice, this power is constrained by tradition, by the privileges of the nobility and clergy, by the ancient regional customs and rights that make France less a unified nation than a patchwork of provinces, each with its own laws and traditions. The tax system is a nightmare of inequity. The clergy and nobility are largely exempt, meaning the burden falls on the third estate, the commoners who comprise 98% of the population. Tax collection is farmed out to private individuals who pay the government a fixed sum and then extract whatever they can from the people, keeping the difference. The entire system is corrupt, inefficient, and profoundly unjust. The economy, meanwhile, lurches from crisis to crisis. France has spent the past century at war almost continuously. The War of Spanish Succession, the War of Polish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and wars are expensive. The national debt has ballooned to catastrophic levels. The 7 Years' War alone cost over 1 billion livres and ended with France stripped of its North American empire, its navy destroyed, its international prestige diminished. The government spends half its annual revenue just servicing the debt. Attempts at financial reform run into the immovable obstacle of aristocratic privilege. The nobles refuse to be taxed. The parliaments, regional courts dominated by nobles, block any legislation that threatens their interests, and the king lacks either the will or the means to force the issue. Into this impossible situation steps Louis XVI, a man of genuine good intentions and catastrophic indecision. He wants to be a reforming monarch, wants to ease his people's burdens, wants to modernize France's government and finances. He appoints capable ministers, Turgot, Necker, later Calonne and Brienne, men who understand the depth of the crisis and propose bold solutions. But Louis XVI cannot bring himself to fully support them when their reforms threaten powerful interests. He wavers, he compromises, he backs down. Time and again, faced with aristocratic resistance, he chooses the path of least conflict, even when he knows it leads nowhere good. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, is trying to find her place in this complex web of power and tradition. As queen, she has certain defined roles. She must appear at court ceremonies, must maintain the rituals of majesty, must above all produce an heir to secure the succession. But her marriage remains unconsummated, and this failure hangs over her like a sword. The court knows. Foreign ambassadors report to their governments about the Queen's childlessness. Pamphlets begin to circulate in Paris, crude and vicious, speculating about why the royal couple has no children, suggesting that perhaps the Queen is sterile, or perhaps the King is impotent, or perhaps the Queen is satisfying her needs elsewhere. These pamphlets, libels they are called, mark the beginning of a propaganda campaign that will eventually destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation entirely. The genre is not new. Crude, sexually explicit attacks on queens and royal mistresses have circulated for decades. But the volume and viciousness aimed at Marie Antoinette will eventually surpass anything previously seen. Even in these early years, the themes are established. She is foreign l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, a slur that plays on the similarity to Chien, bitch. She is frivolous. She spends too much. She has too much influence over her weak husband. She is probably sleeping with someone, probably multiple someones. The reality is more mundane and more sad. Marie Antoinette is a young woman trapped in a marriage that isn't really a marriage, presiding over a court she finds stifling, her every action scrutinized and criticized. She responds by retreating into her own world, surrounding herself with a small circle of favorites, spending money on pleasures that offer temporary escape from the prison of expectation. She becomes obsessed with fashion, working closely with her dressmaker Rose Bertin to create increasingly elaborate and expensive gowns. Her hair becomes a canvas for architectural fantasies, poofs that rise 2 or 3 feet high, styled into shapes representing current events, ships in full sail, gardens with actual flowers, entire scenes from operas and plays. These creations require hours to construct, use frightening amounts of powder and pomade, and must be maintained for days at a time, making sleep difficult and attracting insects. They are also wildly expensive and immediately copied by every woman at court who can afford it, driving up the cost of maintaining aristocratic appearance and adding to the general financial strain on noble families. She redecorates the Petit Trianon, the small chateau on the Versailles grounds that Louis XVI gives her as a personal retreat. Here, she creates a private world, a place where court etiquette is relaxed, where she can entertain her friends without the crushing formality of the main palace. She designs an English garden, fashionable in its studied informality. Its winding paths and rustic bridges a deliberate contrast to the geometric perfection of Lanata's formal gardens. Later, she will create the Hameau de la Réunie, a fantasy farm village where she and her friends can play at being shepherdesses, tending carefully groomed sheep and gathering eggs from elaborately decorated henhouses. To critics, this becomes the ultimate symbol of her detachment from reality, a queen playing farm while real farmers starve. The question of influence, how much power does Marie Antoinette actually have, is complex. Officially, she has no political role. Queens of France are not regent queens or ruling queens. They produce heirs and represent majesty, but policy is the king's domain. In practice, Marie Antoinette does have influence, particularly in matters of patronage and appointments. She supports her friends, pushes their careers, arranges pensions and positions. This is normal court behavior. All queens have done it. But in her case, it feeds the narrative of the Austrian woman manipulating the French crown for foreign interests. The Austrian alliance, that diplomatic revolution that brought Marie Antoinette to France, requires maintenance, and Austria expects its French investment to pay dividends. When Austria and Russia plot to partition Poland in 1772, France stands aside, and critics blame Marie Antoinette's Austrian sympathies. When Austria and Prussia clash over the Bavarian succession in 1778–79, Marie Antoinette does push Louis Roman XVI to support Austria, and France does mediate in Austria's favor, and suddenly the narrative solidifies. She is Austria's agent, sent to control France for Habsburg benefit. The reality is more nuanced, but nuance disappears in the heat of political propaganda. And throughout all of this, the marriage remains unconsummated. Maria Theresa's letters grow increasingly desperate. She sends her son Joseph II, Marie Antoinette's brother, and now Holy Roman Emperor after their father's death, to Versailles in 1777 to investigate the situation personally. Joseph, blunt and reformist, speaks privately with both the king and queen. What exactly he says remains unknown, but whatever combination of advice, persuasion, or pressure he applies works. That summer, something changes. Perhaps Louis XVI finally undergoes the minor surgery needed to correct his condition. Perhaps the royal couple simply overcomes their inhibitions. Either way, in August 1777, Marie Antoinette writes triumphantly to her mother, the marriage has finally been consummated. The consummation of the royal marriage transforms everything, and nothing simultaneously. Marie Antoinette, after 7 years of humiliation and uncertainty, can finally hold her head high. She is truly a wife now, and soon, perhaps, she will be a mother. The French succession, that obsession of monarchies, suddenly seems secure. But the years of failure have left scars. The lampoons and libels have established their narratives. The Queen's reputation, already damaged by her perceived frivolity, cannot be easily repaired by belated marital success. In December 1778, Marie Antoinette realizes she is pregnant. The news electrifies Versailles and is greeted with genuine joy across France. After all the speculation, all the doubt, the Queen will finally produce an heir. The pregnancy proceeds under the microscope of court observation. Every meal analyzed, every activity monitored, physicians hovering constantly. Marie Antoinette, 23 years old and facing the dangers of 18th century childbirth with its staggering maternal mortality, writes to her mother with a mixture of excitement and fear. On December 19, 1778, in the Queen's bedchamber at Versailles, Marie Antoinette goes into labor. What follows is a nightmare of Baroque ritual meeting medical emergency. Etiquette demands that royal births be public events. Anyone of sufficient rank has the right to witness the arrival of a potential heir. The chamber fills with courtiers, nobles, members of the royal family, all crowding forward to see. The windows are sealed against dangerous drafts, making the room stifling. The press of bodies becomes unbearable. Marie Antoinette labors for hours in this airless space before hundreds of watching eyes. Finally, the child emerges, a girl. Marie Thérèse Charlotte, later called Madame Royale. The disappointment is palpable. France needs a male heir, but worse is the Queen's condition. The heat, the crowding, the exhaustion of labor. Marie Antoinette collapses, unconscious, possibly suffering a hemorrhage or seizure. The room erupts in panic. Someone has the presence of mind to force open the sealed windows. Cold December air rushes in. Physicians apply heart compresses and bleed the Queen, standard if useless medical practice. After terrifying minutes, Marie Antoinette revives, weak but alive. Louis XVI, who has watched this ordeal with genuine distress. Whatever else can be said about their marriage, he does care for her, immediately orders reform. Never again will royal childbirth be such a public spectacle. The regulations are changed. Future births will be limited to immediate family and necessary officials. It is a small victory for human dignity over the dehumanizing machinery of royal ritual. Marie Antoinette recovers and throws herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brings to all her passions. She adores her daughter, insists on nursing the child herself, shocking for a queen, as royal infants are always given to wet nurses, though she eventually relents under pressure. She redecorates rooms at Versailles as a nursery. She commissions portraits of herself with her daughter, creating the image of tender maternity that she hopes will soften her public image. But the libels only intensify. If before they accused her of barrenness, now they suggest the child is not the king's. They name supposed fathers, the Count d'Artois, the king's younger brother, various courtiers, even the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who has recently arrived at Versailles and with whom Marie Antoinette has struck up a friendship that will last the rest of her life and fuel endless speculation. Fersen is worth pausing over, for his relationship with Marie Antoinette has generated centuries of historical debate. He is handsome, aristocratic, Swedish but educated in France, a career military officer with impeccable manners and a romantic air. He clearly adores Marie Antoinette, and she clearly values his friendship enormously. Are they lovers? Some historians insist yes, pointing to coded letters and the intensity of their correspondence. Others argue the relationship, while emotionally intimate, remains chaste, a romance of sentiment rather than flesh. The truth is lost to history, but what matters is that contemporaries assume the worst, and the propaganda machine seizes on Fersen as proof of the Queen's adultery. In 1781, Marie Antoinette becomes pregnant again. This time, the stakes are even higher. France desperately needs a male heir. The pregnancy is difficult. She suffers from illness and anxiety throughout. On October 22, 1781, she goes into labor again, this time in the reformed conditions her husband mandated. The birth is quicker, and when the child emerges, the accoucheur announces, "A Dauphine." The joy is delirious. Cannons boom from the Invalides. Church bells across Paris and throughout France ring in celebration. The king weeps openly. Marie Antoinette, exhausted but triumphant, has finally fulfilled her primary duty. She has given France its heir. The boy is named Louis-Joseph Xavier Francois. He is Dauphine from the moment of his birth, heir to the throne, the future of the dynasty made flesh. But even this triumph cannot halt France's slide toward crisis. The nation's financial situation grows more desperate by the month. In 1781, the same year as the Dauphine's birth, Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker serving as Director General of Finances, publishes his Comptes Rendus au Roi, an accounting of France's finances that shocks the nation. The deficit is enormous, larger than anyone outside government circles suspected. Necker, a skilled publicist, frames the problem as one of waste and privilege. The pensions paid to courtiers, the expenses of maintaining Versailles, the tax exemptions enjoyed by nobility and clergy. He suggests that if these abuses were corrected, France's finances could be saved without raising taxes. The Compte Rendu becomes a bestseller, read in salons and coffee houses across France, and it transforms the nature of political discourse. Suddenly, the king's finances are public knowledge, subject to public debate. The mystique of monarchy, which depends on obscurity and distance, begins to crack. And Marie Antoinette, as the most visible symbol of courtly extravagance, becomes the lightning rod for public anger. Her spending, and she does spend lavishly on clothes, jewels, redecorating, gambling, and gifts to favorites, becomes synecdoche for everything wrong with the monarchy. The reality is more complex. Marie Antoinette's personal expenditures, while substantial, are not the cause of France's bankruptcy. The real money goes to servicing the enormous debt accumulated through decades of warfare and to maintaining the military apparatus of a great power. But complexity doesn't make good propaganda. Madame Deficit, the pamphlets call her. Every financial crisis is blamed on the Queen's extravagance, even though she controls only a fraction of royal expenditure and has no say over national fiscal policy. In 1783, France's financial situation is briefly overshadowed by triumph. The American Revolutionary War ends with British defeat and American independence. France has bankrolled the Americans, sending ships, troops, and money across the Atlantic in a successful effort to humiliate Britain and avenge the losses of the 7 Years' War. French officers like Lafayette return as heroes, celebrated in salons, their adventures in America discussed endlessly. The victory feels sweet. France has proven itself still a great power, still capable of challenging British dominance. But the cost is catastrophic. The American war has added over 1 billion livres to France's debt. The interest payments alone now consume more than half the government's annual revenue. Something must be done, but what? Necker falls from power, replaced by Calonne, who tries various expedients. More loans, financial manipulation, anything to avoid the fundamental problem. France's tax system is broken, and fixing it requires forcing the privileged classes to pay their share. While the kingdom lurches from one financial crisis to another, Marie Antoinette's personal life continues its complicated trajectory. In 1785, she becomes pregnant for the 3rd time and gives birth to another son, Louis Charles, Duc de Normandie. She adores her children, particularly little Louis Charles, who is healthy and beautiful where his older brother, the Dauphine, is increasingly sickly. Louis Joseph suffers from tuberculosis of the spine, a condition that will kill him slowly and painfully over the following years. Marie Antoinette watches her eldest son deteriorate, powerless to help him, even as she delights in her younger son's vitality. In 1786, she gives birth to a daughter, Sophie Helene Beatrice, her 4th and final child. The baby is weak from birth and dies before her 1st birthday. Marie Antoinette is devastated. Motherhood has become central to her identity, her refuge from the hostility of the court and the public, and this loss wounds her deeply. But personal grief pales before the public catastrophe unfolding in 1785 and 1786. The affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal so Byzantine, so improbable, that it reads like fiction but damages Marie Antoinette's reputation more than any amount of genuine misconduct could have done. The story begins with a necklace, an obscenely expensive creation of diamonds originally made for Madame du Barry. Louis XV death left it unpurchased, and the jewelers who created it desperately need to sell it. The gems represent their entire fortune. The necklace is worth 1.6 million livres, an astronomical sum. They approach Marie Antoinette, but even she, who has purchased so many jewels, balks at the price. She refuses it repeatedly. Enter Cardinal de Rohan, a prince of the church, member of one of France's great noble families, and a man nursing a deep grudge. Years earlier, while serving as ambassador to Vienna, Rohan offended Empress Maria Theresa with his dissolute behavior. When Marie Antoinette became queen, she refused to receive him at court, honoring her mother's displeasure. Rohan is desperate to regain royal favor, and this desperation makes him vulnerable to manipulation. The manipulator is Jeanne de la Motte, a Khan artist of genius who claims descent from the Valois dynasty, who has insinuated herself into Rohan's circle, and who concocts an extraordinary scheme. She convinces Rohan that she has influence with the Queen, that Marie Antoinette secretly wants to forgive him, that reconciliation is possible. She arranges a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles between Rohan and a woman he believes is the Queen, actually a prostitute who resembles Marie Antoinette and has been coached on how to behave. In the darkness, Rohan kneels before this impostor and receives vague assurances of favor. Now Jeanne de la Motte springs the trap. She tells Rohan that the Queen desperately wants the diamond necklace, but cannot purchase it openly because of public criticism of her spending. Will Rohan purchase it on her behalf, secretly? He will be repaid from the Queen's private funds, and his service will secure her gratitude. Rohan, blinded by ambition and apparently possessing the judgment of a particularly gullible sheep, agrees. He negotiates with the jewelers, promising payment in installments. The necklace is delivered to him, and he hands it over to Jeanne de la Motte, believing she will give it to the Queen. Jeanne and her husband immediately break up the necklace and sell the individual diamonds across Europe. The jewelers receive the first installment, then nothing. They eventually approach the Queen directly, asking when the next payment will arrive. Marie Antoinette has no idea what they're talking about. The fraud unravels. Investigations reveal the whole sordid scheme: the forged letters, the impersonation, the theft. Rohan is arrested in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in his cardinal's robes, about to celebrate Mass. The scandal explodes across France and Europe, and here is where the damage to Marie Antoinette becomes catastrophic. She is the innocent victim in this affair. She never had the necklace, never authorized the purchase, never received a single diamond. But the public doesn't believe it. The story fits too perfectly with the established narrative of Marie Antoinette's extravagance and manipulation. Surely, people think, she must have been involved somehow. Why else would Cardinal Rohan believe she wanted the necklace? The trial becomes a sensation. Rohan's lawyers argue that he was duped by Jeanne de la Motte, that he genuinely believed he was acting on the Queen's behalf. Jeanne is clearly guilty of fraud, but Rohan is a prince of the church, and the Parliament of Paris has no love for the monarchy or the Austrian Queen. In a stunning verdict, the Parliament acquits Rohan and convicts only Jeanne de la Motte and her accomplices. It is a direct slap at the Queen, a public declaration by one of France's most important courts that they find her complicity more plausible than Rohan's innocence. Marie Antoinette is shattered. She has done nothing wrong, but France believes she has. The libels reach new heights of viciousness, portraying her as a scheming adulteress who uses sexual favors to manipulate cardinals and bankrupts the kingdom with her greed for jewels. The phrase, "Elle faire du Calia," becomes synonymous with royal corruption, and though Marie Antoinette is blameless, her reputation never recovers. As the 1780s progress, the drumbeat of crisis intensifies. Calonne, the finance minister, finally admits what everyone who understands arithmetic already knows: France is bankrupt. The debt is unsustainable. Revenue must increase, which means the privileged classes must be taxed. In February 1787, Calonne convenes an assembly of notables, essentially representatives of the nobility and clergy, and proposes a series of reforms, including a universal land tax that would apply even to noble estates. The notables refuse. They will not consent to taxation without representation, ironically using arguments drawn from Enlightenment philosophy and from the example of the American Revolution that France just bankrolled. If the king wants to change the fundamental tax structure, they say, he must convene the Estates General, the ancient representative body that has not met since 1614. Calonne falls from power, replaced by Brienne, who tries the same reforms and faces the same resistance. Louis Roman XVI wavers. He knows the kingdom is sliding toward catastrophe. He knows reform is necessary, but he cannot bring himself to break the power of the privileged classes. He is a king who wants to be loved, who wants to avoid conflict, and so he compromises and delays until compromise and delay are no longer possible. The winter of 1788-89 is brutal. Across France, the harvests have failed. Bread prices soar to levels not seen in decades. In Paris, workers spend half their wages just on bread. In the countryside, peasants face starvation. Riots break out across the kingdom, angry crowds attacking grain convoys, looting bakeries, demanding that the authorities fix bread prices. The royal government, bankrupt and paralyzed, can do little. And in August 1788, facing complete financial collapse and continued resistance from the parliaments and nobility, Louis XVI does what he has desperately tried to avoid. He announces that the Estates General will convene at Versailles in May 1789. It is a momentous decision. No one living in France remembers the last Estates General. No one knows exactly how it should function, what powers it has, how representatives should be chosen. But across France, the announcement generates enormous excitement. After centuries of absolute monarchy, the people will have a voice. Reform will come. The kingdom's problems will be solved. Marie Antoinette watches these developments with growing dread. She understands, perhaps more clearly than her husband, how dangerous this moment is. The political situation is spiraling beyond royal control. The public hatred directed at her personally has become toxic. She is blamed for everything: the bankruptcy, the failed harvests, the political crisis. The libels have become genuinely pornographic, depicting her in orgies with courtiers, with her children, with women, in scenarios of such vulgarity that even describing them violates contemporary standards. The Queen of France has been transformed in the public imagination into a monster of depravity, and nothing she does can alter this perception. In June 1789, her eldest son, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, dies at Meudon after years of worsening illness. He is 7 years old. Marie Antoinette is grief-stricken, but she cannot even mourn publicly. The Estates General is in session, politics consumes everything, and the Queen's personal tragedies are subsumed in the national crisis. Her younger son, Louis Charles, now 4 years old, becomes Dauphine, heir to a throne that is increasingly looking like it might not survive long enough for him to inherit it. The Estates General convenes at Versailles on May 5, 1789, in an atmosphere of hope, confusion, and gathering storm. The deputies arrive from across France, 300 from the First Estate clergy, 300 from the Second Estate nobility, and 600 from the Third Estate, everyone else. This doubling of the Third Estate's representation has been the subject of intense debate and was won only after significant pressure. But questions remain: will the estates vote by order, meaning each estate gets one vote, ensuring the first and second can always outvote the third? Or will they vote by head, meaning the Third Estate's 600 votes would dominate? The opening ceremony is magnificent and ominous. The deputies process to the Church of St. Louis for a mass, the king and queen in full regalia, the estates distinguished by their costumes, clergy in ecclesiastical robes, nobles in silk and gold lace, the Third Estate in plain black. Marie Antoinette appears in public for one of the last times in the full splendor of French queenship. Diamonds, elaborate gown, the hauteur of Bourbon majesty. The Third Estate deputies, many of whom are lawyers and merchants from provincial towns, see her and see everything they have been taught to resent: privilege, extravagance, aristocratic disdain. On May 6, the Estates General meets in the Hôtel des Menus Plaisirs at Versailles. The king speaks, but his speech is vague and disappointing, offering no clear direction. Necker, recalled to power as Director General of Finances, delivers a 3-hour discourse on the kingdom's financial situation that is technical, dense, and offers no bold solutions. The deputies expect inspiration, vision, leadership. Instead, they get accounting. Immediately, the question of voting procedure becomes the central issue. The Third Estate demands vote by head. The nobility refuses. Deadlock. For 6 weeks, nothing happens. The three estates meet separately and argue about procedure. The Third Estate, growing increasingly frustrated and radical, begins to assert itself. On June 17, they declare themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the nation rather than just one estate. It is a revolutionary act. They are essentially claiming sovereignty belongs to them, not to the king. On June 20, finding their usual meeting hall locked, they gather in a nearby tennis court and swear the tennis court oath, pledging not to separate until France has a constitution. Louis XVI, indecisive as always, tries to reassert control. On June 23, he holds a royal session, essentially ordering the estates to meet separately and limiting what they can discuss. The Third Estate refuses to leave. When the king's master of ceremonies tells them to disperse, Marie, one of the deputies, reportedly responds, "Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we will not leave except at the point of a bayonet." The king backs down. The revolution, later historians will say, begins in this moment, when the monarch's authority is challenged and he blinks first. By early July, the National Assembly, now joined by many liberal nobles and clergy, is meeting openly, drafting a constitution, and the king appears powerless to stop them. But appearances deceive. Louis XVI has been bringing troops to the Paris region, Swiss and German regiments, more reliable than French troops who might sympathize with the people. On July 11, he dismisses Necker, the popular finance minister, and appoints more conservative ministers. It looks like preparation for a coup, for military suppression of the assembly. Paris explodes. On July 12, news of Necker's dismissal reaches the city. Crowds gather in the Palais Royal Gardens, listening to orators denounce royal tyranny. Camille Desmoulins, a young journalist, calls for armed resistance. On July 13, crowds loot gunsmiths, seize weapons from the Invalides military hospital. They need gunpowder, and they know where to find it. The Bastille, the old medieval fortress on the eastern edge of Paris, used as a prison but also as an arsenal. July 14, 1789, becomes the most famous date in French history. A crowd of thousands, artisans, shopkeepers, workers, surrounds the Bastille, demanding the gunpowder stored within. The fortress commander, Delaunay, negotiates, stalls, then panics and orders his men to fire on the crowd. Chaos erupts. For hours, the crowd lays siege to the fortress. Finally, with the help of mutinous French guards who bring cannons, the fortress gates are breached. The crowd pours in, kills Delaunay and several guards, parades their severed heads on pikes through Paris. The Bastille, symbol of royal despotism, has fallen. The revolution has claimed its first dramatic victory and spilled its first significant blood. When news reaches Versailles, Louis XVI is supposedly told, "Sire, this is a revolt." He replies, "No, this is a revolution." Whether he actually said this is uncertain, but the assessment is accurate. The world has changed, and the king seems not to fully grasp it. On July 17, he travels to Paris, accepts a tricolour cockade from the revolutionary municipal government, essentially legitimizes the revolution by acknowledging the new power structure. Marie Antoinette, watching her husband make concessions to armed mobs, despairs. The summer of 1789 sees revolutionary fervor sweep across France. In the countryside, the great fear grips the peasantry. Rumors spread of aristocratic conspiracy, of brigands hired by nobles to destroy crops, of imminent attack. Peasants arm themselves, march on noble chateaux, burn feudal records, assert their freedom from ancient obligations. The old order is dissolving. On August 4, in a night of extraordinary drama, the National Assembly, now called the Constituent Assembly, abolishes feudalism. Noble deputies, carried away by revolutionary enthusiasm, or calculating that symbolic concessions might preserve something of their position, renounce their feudal privileges. Hunting rights, special courts, tax exemptions, all the legal structures that defined aristocratic superiority. By morning, 1,000 years of feudal tradition has been swept away, at least on paper. On August 26, the Assembly promulgates the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a document influenced by American and Enlightenment thought, asserting liberty, equality, property rights, sovereignty of the nation rather than the king. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette watches her world collapse. The Assembly is debating what limits to place on royal power, whether the king should have veto over legislation, what kind of constitution France should have. Foreign powers, Austria, Prussia, other monarchies, watch with alarm but do not intervene. Marie Antoinette writes desperate letters to her family in Austria, begging for help, but help does not come. Her brother Joseph II, the reforming emperor who once counseled her on her marriage, is preoccupied with his own troubles, war with Turkey, unrest in the Austrian Netherlands. Food shortages continue. In Paris, bread is scarce and expensive. Women who bear responsibility for feeding their families are especially desperate. On October 5, a crowd of thousands of Parisian women, Market vendors, working women, accompanied by men and National Guardsmen, march from Paris to Versailles in pouring rain. They are armed with pikes, muskets, kitchen knives. They are hungry, angry, and they blame the king and especially the queen for their suffering. The women invade the assembly, demanding bread. Then they surround the palace itself. The king, confronted by a delegation, promises to approve the assembly's latest decrees, promises that grain will be sent to Paris. But the crowd is not satisfied. They camp in the palace courtyards through the rainy night. Early on the morning of October 6, some break into the palace, fight with guards, kill two, nearly reach the queen's apartments. Marie Antoinette, woken by her attendants, flees to the king's chambers in her nightgown, seconds ahead of the mob. Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, restores order. But the crowd demands that the royal family return to Paris with them. After hours of negotiation and with no real choice, the king agrees. In mid-afternoon, on October 6, 1789, the royal family leaves Versailles, traveling to Paris surrounded by thousands of armed citizens, pikes bearing the heads of slain guards, women singing songs about hanging the queen. It takes 6 hours to cover the 12 miles to Paris. They are installed in the Tuileries palace, in the heart of the capital, effectively prisoners of the revolution. Marie Antoinette will never see Versailles again. The Tuileries Palace in October 1789 is a gilded cage. Built in the 16th century and used sporadically by French monarchs who preferred Versailles, it sits between the Seine and the Rue de Rivoli, adjacent to the Louvre, in the very heart of revolutionary Paris. The royal family occupies apartments hastily prepared for them, comfortable but not palatial, and they are never alone. National Guardsmen patrol the corridors. Revolutionary officials monitor who comes and goes. Outside the palace gates, crowds gather daily, watching, commenting, sometimes shouting insults or threats. Marie Antoinette tries to maintain some semblance of normal royal life. She dresses in the morning with her attendants, though the elaborate rituals of Versailles have been abandoned. She spends time with her children. Her daughter Marie Therese, now 11, serious and resembling her father, the Dauphin Louis Charles, now 4, a beautiful child who is his mother's favorite, and the baby Sophie, who will die the following summer. She reads, writes letters, receives the few friends still willing to visit, but the fear never leaves her. She has seen the mob at close range. She has heard them calling for her death. She knows how precarious their situation is. Louis XVI, meanwhile, engages with the new political reality in his ineffectual way. He agrees to the Assembly's decrees. He cooperates with the new constitutional order, but he does not believe in it. In his heart, he remains an absolute monarch by divine right, and he views the Constitution being drafted as an illegitimate constraint on his God-given authority. He believes that if he can just wait, just survive, the revolution will exhaust itself and loyal forces will restore him to full power. It is a catastrophic misreading of the situation. The Assembly, now meeting in Paris in the Mange near the Tuileries, continues its work of remaking France. They reorganize the entire country into departments, replacing the old provinces with rationalized administrative units. They nationalize church lands, seizing the vast estates of monasteries and bishoprics to pay off the national debt. They issue the assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church property, which will eventually contribute to ruinous inflation. They pass the civil constitution of the clergy, essentially making priests into civil servants paid by the state, requiring them to swear loyalty to the nation rather than the Pope. This last measure splits France. Some clergy accept the oath and become constitutional clergy. Others refuse and become refractory priests, faithful to Rome but outlawed in France. The Revolution, which began as a political and economic transformation, becomes a religious civil war. Marie Antoinette, a devout Catholic, is horrified by the treatment of the Church. She attends masses celebrated by refractory priests in defiance of the law. She corresponds secretly with foreign courts, urging them to intervene against the revolution. Her rooms at the Tuileries become the center of counter-revolutionary plotting, though the plots are generally incompetent, poorly coordinated, and easily penetrated by revolutionary spies. She places her hopes in her family, her brother Leopold II, Joseph having died in 1790, the Austrian emperor, and her sister Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples. Surely, she believes, the monarchies of Europe will not permit revolutionaries to destroy the French throne. Surely help will come, but help does not come, or at least not effective help. Austria and Prussia issue the Declaration of Pillnitz in August 1791, expressing concern about the French royal family and suggesting that European powers might intervene, but only if all major powers agree to act together, which everyone knows they will not. The declaration is empty posturing, but in France, it is seen as proof of foreign conspiracy, of the king and queen colluding with foreign powers against the nation, because that is exactly what they are doing. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI have decided to escape. Throughout the spring of 1791, plans are laid for the royal family to flee Paris, make their way to the eastern frontier where the Marquis de Bouillé commands loyal troops, and from that secure base, either rally royalist forces within France or call in foreign armies. It is a desperate plan with little chance of success, but desperation clouds judgment. On the night of June 2021, 1791, the escape attempt unfolds. The royal family, traveling in disguise, the king as a valet, the queen as a governess, leaves the Tuileries in a heavy Berlin carriage accompanied by loyal attendants. They make it out of Paris undetected. For hours, it seems the plan might work. They pass through small towns, change horses at post stations, moving steadily east, but everything takes longer than planned. The heavy carriage moves slowly. They fall behind schedule, and crucially, the king is recognized. At Varennes, a small town near the frontier, the postmaster Drouet recognizes Louis XVI from his portrait on the new paper currency. Drouet rides ahead, rouses the town. When the royal carriage arrives, it is stopped by National Guardsmen and armed citizens. The king's identity is confirmed. The royal family is held while messengers race to Paris. On June 25, they are brought back to the capital, traveling through crowds that line the roads in absolute silence, more terrifying than shouts, this silence, this judgment. In Paris, revolutionary leaders debate what to do. Some call for abolishing the monarchy entirely. Others, particularly the moderates who control the assembly, decide to maintain the fiction that the king was kidnapped against his will, that he remains a loyal constitutional monarch. The flight to Varennes, as it becomes known, destroys any remaining trust in Louis XVI. If he would flee his people, conspire with foreign powers, break his oath to the Constitution, then he is a traitor. The new Constitution is promulgated in September 1791, transforming France into a constitutional monarchy with a legislative assembly elected by property-holding citizens. Louis XVI swears to uphold it, but no one believes his oath. Marie Antoinette doesn't even pretend. She refers to the Constitution with contempt in her letters, calls the revolutionaries criminals and usurpers, prays for foreign armies to invade and restore absolute monarchy. And foreign armies are coming, though not in the way Marie Antoinette hopes. Revolutionary France and monarchical Europe are on a collision course. In April 1792, France declares war on Austria, ironically because both revolutionaries and the king want war. The revolutionaries believe it will expose traitors and spread revolutionary ideals. The king hopes French armies will be defeated and foreign powers will restore his authority. The war goes badly at first for France. Austrian and Prussian armies invade. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding the coalition forces, issues a manifesto threatening to destroy Paris if any harm comes to the royal family. The manifesto, probably influenced by Marie Antoinette's correspondence with the émigré community, is supposed to protect the king and queen. Instead, it dooms them by confirming that they are in league with France's enemies. Paris explodes in fury. On August 10, 1792, a massive insurrection storms the Tuileries. The king and queen, with their children and the Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister, flee to the Legislative Assembly for protection. Behind them, the Tuileries is sacked. The Swiss guard defending the palace fights to the death. 600 soldiers killed by the mob. The revolutionaries take power, suspend the king, imprison the royal family in the Temple, a medieval fortress in the Marais district. The monarchy, for all practical purposes, has ended. The Temple is not a palace. It is a medieval fortress, built centuries ago by the Knights Templar, its stone towers rising stark and forbidding in the working-class Marais district of Paris. When the royal family arrives on August 13, 1792, escorted by revolutionary guards and followed by hostile crowds, they enter a world utterly alien to everything they have known. The Great Tower, cold and damp even in summer, becomes their prison. The rooms are furnished hastily with items salvaged from the Tuileries, but no amount of gilded furniture can disguise the reality. They are captives, and their captors make no pretense otherwise. The family is confined to a few rooms in the tower. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their 2 children, and Madame Elizabeth must live in proximity they never experienced even in their most intimate family moments at Versailles. The guards rotate constantly, and many take deliberate pleasure in humiliating their former sovereigns. They blow tobacco smoke in Marie Antoinette's face. They refuse to remove their hats in the royal presence, a calculated insult in an age where such gestures carry enormous symbolic weight. They sing revolutionary songs outside the royal chambers, songs with verses calling for aristocrats to be hanged, for the queen to be guillotined. They address the king and queen as capit, using the family name rather than royal titles, reducing them to common citizens. Yet even here, even as prisoners, the family tries to maintain some structure, some dignity. Louis Roman XVI, who has always preferred routine and simple pleasures, establishes a schedule. He wakes at 6, reads, tutors his son in geography and history, takes meals at fixed hours. He requests books from the municipal library and reads voraciously, histories, classics, religious texts. He remains plump despite everything, still possessed of his prodigious appetite. His jailers marvel at how much the former king can eat. Marie Antoinette ages visibly in these months. The woman who once set fashion for all of Europe now wears simple dresses, her hair unpowdered and increasingly grey. She is 37 years old, but stress and fear make her look a decade older. She spends her days with her daughter Marie Therese, teaching her, reading with her, trying to preserve some normalcy for the girl who has seen her world destroyed. She dotes on her son, the Dauphin Louis Charles, now 7 years old, a beautiful child who still plays with his toys, uncomprehending of the full horror of their situation. Outside the temple, France lurches toward new extremes. In September 1792, as Prussian armies advance toward Paris and panic grips the city, mobs descend on the prisons of Paris and massacre over 1,000 prisoners, aristocrats, refractory priests, common criminals, anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathies. The September massacres mark a new level of revolutionary violence. Among the victims is the Princess de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's dear friend, torn apart by the mob. They parade her severed head on a pike beneath the temple windows, forcing the queen to look upon it. Marie Antoinette faints at the sight. On September 20, 1792, French revolutionary armies halt the Prussian advance at the Battle of Valmy. It is more of a cannonade than a battle. The two armies fire artillery at each other for hours, then the Prussians withdraw. But psychologically it is transformative. The revolution has stopped the professional armies of Europe. France, it seems, can defend itself. The next day, September 21, the newly elected National Convention abolishes the monarchy and proclaims France a republic. Year one of the republic begins. Louis XVI is now simply Louis Capet, citizen and prisoner. But what to do with him? The question consumes the convention through the fall of 1792. The Girondins, moderate republicans who dominate initially, are reluctant to execute the king. The Montagnards, radical republicans led by Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, argue that Louis XVI must die to secure the revolution. In November, papers are discovered in the Tuileries. The king's correspondence with foreign powers, evidence of his counter-revolutionary plotting. The case for treason becomes overwhelming. On December 11, 1792, Louis XVI is brought from the temple to face the convention. He stands before hundreds of deputies who were once his subjects and are now his judges. They read the charges: conspiring with foreign powers, attempting to flee the country, betraying the constitution he swore to uphold. Louis Roman XVI defends himself with quiet dignity, denying some charges, explaining others, but the outcome is predetermined. On January 15, 1793, the convention votes on the verdict. 693 deputies find him guilty. On January 16, they vote on the sentence. By the narrowest of margins, 361 to 360, they choose death over imprisonment. The night before his execution, Louis XVI is allowed a final visit with his family. They spend 2 hours together in a room in the temple, the king, the queen, their 2 children, and Madame Elisabeth. What they say to each other is not recorded. The guards are instructed to watch but not listen. But witnesses report constant sobbing, desperate embraces, the children clinging to their father. At 10 o'clock, Louis XVI tears himself away, promising to see them again in the morning. It is a lie of mercy. He knows he will never see them alive again. On the morning of January 21, 1793, a cold, grey Paris morning, Louis XVI is taken in a closed carriage through streets lined with National Guard to the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV, where his grandfather's statue once stood. A scaffold has been erected, and upon it stands the guillotine, that machine of enlightened execution, designed by Dr. Guillotin to make death swift and equal for all citizens. Thousands of Parisians crowd the square, held back by soldiers, watching in near silence. Louis XVI mounts the scaffold with composure. He tries to speak, to address the crowd, to proclaim his innocence and forgive his executioners. But drums roll, drowning his words. The executioners, including the famous Charles Henry Sanson, bind him to the plank. The blade falls. The former King of France dies in an instant. Sanson lifts the severed head and shows it to the crowd. Some cheer, some weep. Some stand frozen in shock at what they have just witnessed, the execution of monarchy itself. In the temple, Marie Antoinette hears the cannon boom that signals her husband's death. She collapses. When she recovers, she is a widow, alone with her children and her sister-in-law, surrounded by enemies, in a nation that has just demonstrated its willingness to kill kings. She is no longer the Queen of France. There is no France, only the Republic. But she is still a symbol, still dangerous to those in power, still a target for the rage of revolutionaries who see in her everything wrong with the old order. The months following Louis XVI execution are purgatory. Marie Antoinette, now referred to as the Widow Capet, is moved to even more restricted quarters in the temple. Her children remain with her initially, but she knows this cannot last. The Republic considers young Louis Charles, whom royalists in exile have proclaimed Louis XVII, a potential rallying point for counter-revolution. As long as the boy lives, monarchists have a king to restore. The child must be separated from his mother's influence, must be re-educated as a Republican citizen. On July 3, 1793, in a scene of almost unbearable cruelty, guards come to take the 8-year-old Dauphine from his mother. Marie Antoinette refuses to release him. She holds her son, barricading herself and the children in their room, refusing to open the door. For hours, the standoff continues, the guards threatening to kill all of them if she doesn't surrender the boy. Finally, realizing resistance is futile, Marie Antoinette kisses her son one final time and watches as he is taken away to a lower floor of the tower. She will never see him again, though she can sometimes hear his voice through the stones, crying for his mother. The boy is placed in the care of Antoine Simon, a cobbler and fervent revolutionary tasked with transforming the prince into a proper republican. What happens to Louis Charles in the following months is disputed and horrible. He is dressed in the red cap of liberty, taught revolutionary songs, encouraged to denounce his family. Some accounts suggest worse abuses, that he is kept in filth, beaten, possibly sexually abused. The truth is obscured by revolutionary propaganda and later monarchist embellishment. But what is certain is that the healthy, beautiful child who entered the temple emerges broken, if he emerges at all. Marie Antoinette, separated from her son, confined with only her daughter Marie Therese and Madame Elisabeth, sinks into deep depression. Her hair turns entirely white. She suffers from hemorrhaging, possibly uterine cancer, or perhaps the physical manifestation of unbearable stress. She grows thin, wraith-like. The woman who once danced until dawn at Versailles now spends her days staring at walls, clutching her daughter, waiting for whatever end the revolutionaries have planned. That end is approaching. By the summer of 1793, France is in crisis. The Republic is at war with most of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, Portugal, the Italian states, a coalition determined to crush the revolution. Inside France, counter-revolution erupts in the Vendée region, where royalist Catholic peasants rise in rebellion against Republican rule. Federalist revolts break out in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, major cities rejecting the radical government in Paris. The Republic appears to be collapsing. The response is the terror. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre and the radical Montagnards, assumes dictatorial powers. The Revolutionary Tribunal is given authority to try enemies of the Republic without appeal. The guillotine, moved to the Place de la Révolution, begins its grim work in earnest. Former nobles, refractory priests, giant politicians, anyone accused of insufficient revolutionary zeal. By the end of the Terror, perhaps 40,000 people will be executed and hundreds of thousands more imprisoned. In this atmosphere of paranoid extremism, Marie Antoinette's continued existence becomes intolerable to the revolutionary government. She is a symbol of the old order, a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries, and in the paranoid logic of the Terror, an active conspirator against the Republic. On August 2, 1793, at 2 o'clock in the morning, guards come to Marie Antoinette's room. She is to be transferred to the conciergerie, the prison attached to the Palais de Justice, where enemies of the Republic await trial. She is allowed to dress and take a few belongings. She embraces her daughter one final time, Marie Thérèse, just 15 years old, clinging to her mother, both of them knowing they will never meet again. Then Marie Antoinette, widow Capet, prisoner 280, descends from the temple into a closed carriage that carries her through the dark Paris streets to her final prison. The conciergerie is medieval, dank, built on the Isle de la Cité, where the Seine flows through the heart of Paris. Marie Antoinette is placed in a cell barely 6 feet wide, separated from the corridor by a screen. She has a cot, a chair, a small table. Guards watch her constantly. She has no privacy, even for the most intimate bodily functions. The cell is dark, damp, infested with rats. It is designed to break her, to transform the former queen into a broken woman who will confess whatever the revolutionaries want her to confess. She remains there for 2.5 months, her health deteriorating daily. She bleeds constantly, soaking through the rags she must use. She can barely eat. She sleeps fitfully, haunted by nightmares. A few friends try to arrange an escape, a royalist conspiracy involving forged papers and a sympathetic guard. But the plot is discovered, and after that, surveillance intensifies. She's transferred to an even smaller, more secure cell. Any hope of rescue dies. On October 12, 1793, Marie Antoinette is informed that she will be tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal. The charges are prepared: conspiracy with foreign powers, wasting the national treasury, conspiring to cause civil war, and more. The trial is scheduled for October 14. She has 2 days to prepare, and she is not allowed legal counsel until the last minute. The Revolutionary Tribunal in October 1793 is not a court in any meaningful sense. It is an instrument of political terror, designed to give a veneer of legality to predetermined executions. The judges are revolutionary militants. The jury is selected for ideological reliability. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, is less interested in justice than in securing convictions. Defendants have minimal rights, no appeal, and trials often last mere hours before the inevitable guilty verdict and death sentence. But Marie Antoinette's trial must be different, must be more elaborate, because she is not just any prisoner. She is the widow of the king, the symbol of the old order, known throughout Europe and America. Her trial must demonstrate to France and the world that the Republic is just, that monarchy was criminal, that the revolution is right. And so her trial, beginning on the morning of October 14, 1793, in the great hall of the Palais de Justice, becomes a spectacle. Marie Antoinette, dressed in simple black mourning clothes, her white hair covered by a white cap, enters the courtroom at 8 in the morning. She is so weak she can barely walk, and she is seated in a wooden chair facing her accusers. Before her sit the 5 judges led by Marshal Herman. To the side, the jury of 12 men. Behind them, the public galleries packed with revolutionary militants, women knitting as they watch. The famous tricotuses who attend every trial, cheering convictions and jeering acquittals. The indictment is read. It is a catalogue of accusations accumulated over years of revolutionary propaganda. She conspired with Austria to attack France. She sent millions of livres to Austria to fund war against the revolution. She organized the orgy at Versailles that supposedly sparked the October 1789 march. She influenced the king's decisions, manipulated him, controlled him. She is called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, the foreign influence that corrupted France. But beyond the political charges, there is something else, something more visceral in its cruelty. Hebert, the radical journalist who publishes the revolutionary newspaper Le Pied Duchesne, testifies. He claims to have evidence, supposedly from young Louis Charles himself, that Marie Antoinette committed incest with her son, that she sexually abused the Dauphine, that she engaged in masturbatory acts with him. The courtroom stirs. Even by the standards of revolutionary propaganda, this is extraordinary. Marie Antoinette, who has sat silently through hours of political accusations, maintaining the blank expression of exhausted dignity, suddenly responds. She stands, shaking, and addresses the court directly. Nature itself recoils at such an accusation against a mother, she says, her voice breaking. I appeal to all mothers who may be present. The women in the gallery, even the hardened tricotuses, are moved. Some weep. Even Robespierre, when he hears of Hebert's testimony, reportedly criticizes it as excessive. They don't need to accuse her of incest to execute her. But the damage is done, and the prosecution continues. For 16 hours, the trial continues. Witnesses testify, servants from Versailles who claim to have seen her write letters to Austria, officials who repeat rumors and hearsay, revolutionaries who interpret every action as evidence of conspiracy. Marie Antoinette responds to each charge with dignity, denying the most outrageous accusations, admitting to writing to her family, but claiming this was natural, insisting that she acted as any mother and wife would act. She is clearly exhausted, swaying in her chair, but she does not collapse, does not break. Her 2 court-appointed lawyers, Chauveau-Lagarde and Tronçon-Ducaudray, try to defend her, but they have had almost no time to prepare, and they work within a system designed to produce guilt. They point out the lack of actual evidence, the reliance on hearsay and presumption, the absurdity of some charges. It doesn't matter. At 4 o'clock in the morning on October 16, after a trial lasting 16 hours with only brief recesses, the judges send the jury to deliberate. The deliberation takes an hour. The verdict is unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentence is death, to be carried out the same day. Marie Antoinette, who has barely slept in days, who is weak from illness and interrogation, receives the news without visible emotion. She is taken back to her cell in the conciergerie to await execution. She writes a final letter, addressed to Madame Elisabeth, her sister-in-law still imprisoned in the temple. It is a remarkable document, filled with forgiveness and Catholic faith. She asks forgiveness from anyone she may have harmed. She forgives her enemies. She expresses concern for her children, hoping that one day they will be reunited with surviving family. She proclaims her innocence of the crimes of which she has been convicted. She entrusts herself to God. The letter will never reach Madame Elisabeth. It is intercepted and not published until years later, but it survives as Marie Antoinette's final testimony, her own words unfiltered by propaganda. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the executioner arrives. Charles Henry Sanson, the same man who executed Louis XVI, will execute his widow. Marie Antoinette's hands are bound behind her back. Unlike her husband, she is not afforded even this small dignity. Her hair is cut short to expose her neck for the blade. She is dressed in a simple white dress, and she is led out into the courtyard where the executioner's cart waits. Not for her the closed carriage that brought her husband to the scaffold. Marie Antoinette will ride through Paris in an open cart, displayed to the mob, a final humiliation. An artist, Jacques-Louis David, sketches her as she passes, a quick, brutal image showing a haggard woman, mouth tight, eyes defiant, or perhaps simply vacant with exhaustion. This sketch will become iconic, fixing Marie Antoinette's final appearance in history. The cart moves slowly through the streets of Paris. It is a route of perhaps 2 miles from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, but it takes over an hour as the cart moves through crowds that line the streets. Some jeer, some cheer. Some watch in silence, perhaps feeling some stirring of pity for this woman who was once their queen and is now merely another victim of the guillotine. Marie Antoinette sits upright in the cart, her bound hands behind her, her face expressionless, looking neither left nor right. At 12:15, the cart reaches the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine stands where Louis Roman XVI died 9 months earlier. Marie Antoinette descends from the cart. As she climbs the scaffold steps, she accidentally steps on the executioner's foot. Her last recorded words are an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Manners, etiquette, the habits of a lifetime persist even here, even now in the final seconds of her life. She is positioned at the guillotine. The executioners work quickly. They have done this hundreds of times. The lannette closes around her neck, holding her in place. The blade, suspended high above, is released. It falls with terrible speed. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, dies instantly at 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793. She is 37 years old. Sanson lifts her severed head and shows it to the crowd. Cannon fire announces that justice has been done. The body and head are taken away in a basket and buried in an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, quicklime poured over the remains. The former Queen of France, who once lived in the greatest luxury the 18th century could provide, lies in an anonymous grave, her body disintegrating in caustic lime. The revolution has consumed her utterly, but the story does not end with Marie Antoinette's death. Her children remain in the temple, and their fates are part of the tragedy. Young Louis Charles, the boy whom royalists call Louis XVII, remains in the cobbler Simon's care until January 1794, when Simon is recalled to other duties. The child is then locked alone in a cell, essentially abandoned. Revolutionary authorities, uncertain what to do with him but unable to release or execute a 10-year-old, simply leave him in isolation. For months, the boy lives in a dark cell with minimal human contact. Food is pushed through a slot in the door. No one cleans his room or his body. He becomes ill, probably tubercular scrofula, a disease that causes painful swelling of the lymph nodes. By the spring of 1795, after the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror, authorities finally check on the child and are horrified by what they find. The boy is desperately ill, his body covered in sores and tumors, unable to speak coherently. On June 8, 1795, he dies in the temple, just short of his 10th birthday. The official cause is tuberculosis, but neglect and abuse killed him as surely as any disease. His death creates a vacuum that is filled by impostors. Over the following decades, over 100 men will claim to be Louis XVII, the lost Dauphine who supposedly escaped the temple and survived in hiding. The most famous is Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a German clockmaker who in the 1830s presents himself as the true king of France, complete with childhood memories and physical marks that seem to match. The French government rejects his claims, but he maintains them until his death, and his descendants continue to assert their royal lineage into the 20th century. DNA testing in 2000, comparing mitochondrial DNA from the heart of the boy who died in the temple with living descendants of Marie Antoinette's family, finally proves conclusively that the child who died in 1795 was indeed Louis Charles, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Marie Therese, the daughter, survives. She remains imprisoned in the temple until December 1795, when she is exchanged for French prisoners held by Austria. At 17, she has lost her father to the guillotine, her mother to the guillotine, her brother to neglect and disease, and her aunt, Madame Elisabeth, to the guillotine in May 1794. She is the sole survivor of the immediate family that lived in the temple. She is sent to Austria, where she eventually marries her cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, son of the Count d'Artois, who will later briefly reign as Charles X. She will never have children, whether from physical inability or from psychological trauma. Her reproductive capacity is destroyed. When the Bourbon Restoration occurs after Napoleon's fall, she returns to France, but she is a haunted woman, scarred by memories of the terror. She survives until 1851, dying at 72, the last direct survivor of Marie Antoinette's immediate family, carrying to her grave the horrors she witnessed as a teenage girl. Now, we must return to the question that began our journey. Let them eat cake. Where does this phrase come from? Why do millions of people across the world believe Marie Antoinette said it? The answer reveals how historical myths are created, propagated, and become more powerful than truth. The phrase in French is quils mangent de la brioche. Let them eat brioche. Brioche being a rich bread made with butter and eggs, a luxury item. The story goes that Marie Antoinette, told that the peasants had no bread, suggested with callous indifference that if they lacked bread, they should simply eat cake or brioche instead, demonstrating her complete detachment from the suffering of ordinary people. But Marie Antoinette never said this. The evidence is conclusive. First, the phrase appears in print before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his autobiographical work, Confessions, written around 1765-1770, but describing events from even earlier, tells an anecdote. Finally, I remembered the stopgap solution of a great princess who was told that the peasants had no bread, and who responded, "Let them eat brioche." Rousseau doesn't identify this great princess, and he is describing something that supposedly happened when he was young, perhaps in the 1740s, when Marie Antoinette was not yet born. The phrase is actually much older. It appears to be a variant of a type of story that circulates about various royal and aristocratic women for centuries. The queen or princess so removed from reality that she cannot comprehend that poor people lack food. Variations of the story are told about Maria Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, about Madame Sophie, one of Louis XV daughters, about various German princesses. It is a folkloric motif, a story that attaches to different women in different times because it tells a larger truth about aristocratic disconnection from common life. So why does it stick to Marie Antoinette? Because it fits. By the time of the Revolution, Marie Antoinette's reputation has been so thoroughly destroyed by years of propaganda that any story of aristocratic excess and callousness seems plausible if attributed to her. The libels have portrayed her as spending wildly while people starve, as caring only for pleasure and luxury, as utterly indifferent to French suffering. The "let them eat cake" story encapsulates all of this in one perfect, memorable phrase. The phrase begins to be specifically attributed to Marie Antoinette after her death, as revolutionary and republican writers consolidate the narrative of royal excess that justifies the revolution. By the 1820s and 1830s, as historians begin writing comprehensive accounts of the revolution, the story is repeated as fact. By the late 19th century, it is established as historical truth in popular consciousness, appearing in textbooks, biographies, novels, and plays. The persistence of the myth reveals something about historical memory. Facts are complicated, nuanced, requiring context and explanation. Myths are simple, memorable, emotionally satisfying. "Let them eat cake" tells us everything we think we know about Marie Antoinette, her privilege, her callousness, her disconnection from reality, in 4 words. The fact that she never said it becomes irrelevant. The phrase is too perfect, too useful, too ideologically potent to abandon merely because it's false. So who was Marie Antoinette really, stripped of mythology and propaganda? The answer is complex, human, and tragic. She was a woman caught in forces far beyond her control or understanding, a person neither saint nor monster but something in between, flawed, limited, but also brave in her way, loving as a mother, loyal to her family and friends, and ultimately a victim of circumstances she did not create. The real Marie Antoinette was not politically sophisticated. She had been raised to be decorative, not to govern. Her education focused on arts and social graces, not statecraft. When she arrived in France as a 14-year-old, she was utterly unprepared for the complex, dangerous world of Versailles politics. She made mistakes, favoring friends too openly, spending too lavishly, involving herself in matters beyond her understanding. But these were errors of judgment and immaturity, not evidence of malicious intent. She was extravagant, certainly. Her spending on fashion, gambling, and redecorating was excessive by any standard. But this must be contextualized. She was hardly unique among French royalty or European aristocracy in her expenditures. Her spending, while substantial, was not the cause of France's bankruptcy. That came from wars, from the inefficient tax system, from the structural problems of absolute monarchy in an age of rising population and changing economy. Blaming Marie Antoinette for France's financial crisis is like blaming a household's dinner expenses for a mortgage crisis. It confuses symptoms with causes. Was she politically influential? Yes, but within strict limits. She could advance careers of favorites, could push the king on specific issues, but she did not control policy. Louis XVI was not a puppet. He was indecisive and weak-willed, but the decisions were ultimately his. When Marie Antoinette tried to influence politics, she often failed. Her supposed control over French foreign policy is vastly exaggerated by both contemporary propagandists and later historians. Was she pro-Austrian? Of course, she maintained emotional and familial loyalty to her birth country. This is completely natural and expected. Royal marriage was supposed to cement alliances, and part of Marie Antoinette's function was to maintain good relations between France and Austria. Criticizing her for this is criticizing her for doing what she was sent to France to do. Whether she placed Austrian interests above French interests is a more complex question, and the evidence is mixed. In some instances, yes, but she was hardly unique among royal consorts in maintaining loyalty to birth families. The reality is that Marie Antoinette was trapped from the beginning. She was sent to France as a tool of diplomacy, expected to produce heirs and cement an alliance. When her marriage remained unconsummated for 7 years, she became vulnerable to attacks based on her failure to fulfill her primary function. When she finally did produce children and tried to be a good mother, she was criticized for being too involved with her children, too domestic. When she tried to escape the suffocating ritual of Versailles by creating private spaces at the Petit Trianon, she was accused of hiding away to conduct affairs and waste money. When she tried to influence politics, she was condemned as a manipulative foreign agent. When she remained silent, she was accused of arrogance and disdain for the French people. There was literally nothing Marie Antoinette could do that would not be interpreted negatively by her enemies. This is the nature of scapegoating. The scapegoat is guilty by definition, and all evidence is interpreted to confirm that guilt. Marie Antoinette became the symbol onto which revolutionaries could project all the sins of the old regime, all the justifications for violence and upheaval. She had to be a monster for the revolution to be righteous. But was the revolution right to execute her? This question has been debated for 2 centuries. From the revolutionary perspective, she was indeed a traitor. She did correspond with foreign powers, did hope for and encourage foreign intervention against the revolution, did work to undermine the constitutional order. These actions, by the standards of any government at war, constitute treason. From another perspective, she was a woman trying to protect her family and preserve her husband's authority in a situation that had become lawless and violent. She had no obligation to cooperate with people who held her prisoner, who murdered her friends, who threatened her children. What is clear is that executing Marie Antoinette did not serve any practical purpose. By October 1793, the monarchy was dead, Louis XVI was dead, the Republic was established. Marie Antoinette was a sick woman in her late 30s, imprisoned and powerless. She posed no actual threat. Her execution was symbolic, a ritual sacrifice, a demonstration that the revolution would show no mercy to the symbols of the old order. It was also revenge. Revenge for centuries of aristocratic privilege, revenge for the suffering of the poor, revenge that happened to fall on one woman who became the avatar for all that anger. Marie Antoinette's reputation after her death follows a strange trajectory. During the Revolution and the Napoleonic period, she remains the villainess of revolutionary mythology. The Austrian woman who betrayed France, the spendthrift who bankrupted the kingdom, the callous aristocrat who let them eat cake. But with the Bourbon Restoration in 1814-1815, when Louis the XVI brother, takes the throne, Marie Antoinette begins a rehabilitation. The restored monarchy seeks out her remains. In 1815, her body and Louis Roman XVI are exhumed from the Madeleine Cemetery, where they were dumped in 1793. The remains are identified, difficult after 2 decades in quicklime, but possible through circumstantial evidence and the testimony of those who remembered the burials. On January 21, 1815, the anniversary of Louis XVI execution, the royal couple are reinterred with full ceremony in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional burial place of French monarchs. A memorial is erected. Marie Antoinette becomes, posthumously, what she never was in life: a martyr, a victim, a symbol of royal dignity destroyed by revolutionary excess. Throughout the 19th century, as historians begin seriously studying the Revolution, Marie Antoinette is gradually transformed from villain to victim. Memoirs are published by those who knew her: Madame Campan, her lady-in-waiting, the Comte de la Marque, various émigrés who survived the Terror. These accounts, while often self-serving and sometimes unreliable, present a more sympathetic picture: Marie Antoinette as a woman who loved her children, who showed courage in imprisonment, who faced death with dignity. In 1858, a sensational discovery: the Austrian ambassador Count Mercy Argenteau's correspondence with Maria Theresa. Thousands of letters documenting Marie Antoinette's early years in France, her struggles with the unconsummated marriage, her mother's constant criticism and advice. These letters, published and widely discussed, humanize Marie Antoinette, showing her as a young woman trying desperately to please an overbearing mother while navigating an impossible situation. Biographers begin producing massive, detailed studies. The brothers Goncourt publish Histoire de Marie Antoinette in 1858, a sympathetic portrayal that uses extensive documentation. Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer, publishes his biography in 1932, presenting Marie Antoinette as a mediocre woman in extraordinary circumstances, neither saint nor demon, but human. Antonia Fraser's 2001 biography continues this rehabilitation, meticulously documenting Marie Antoinette's life and systematically debunking the myths. But popular culture tells a different story. In novels, plays, films, and eventually television, Marie Antoinette remains fascinating precisely because of her mythological status. She appears in countless works: tragic heroine in some, frivolous aristocrat in others, sometimes both simultaneously. Sofia Coppola's 2006 film, Marie Antoinette, presents her as a teenage girl overwhelmed by a world she never made, set to an anachronistic rock soundtrack that emphasizes her youth and alienation. The film is historically loose, but emotionally accurate. This was a woman trapped by forces beyond her control. The "let them eat cake" myth proves impossible to dislodge from popular consciousness, despite historians' repeated attempts to correct it. It appears in textbooks, in casual conversation, in political discourse, as shorthand for aristocratic or elite disconnection from ordinary people's struggles. When politicians or celebrities say something tone-deaf, they are accused of "let them eat cake" moments. The phrase has transcended its false attribution to become a permanent part of cultural vocabulary. In 2000, DNA testing finally resolves one of the persistent mysteries of Marie Antoinette's story. The heart of the child who died in the temple in 1795 was preserved, a common practice at the time for royal remains, and passed through various hands over 2 centuries. In 2000, scientists extract mitochondrial DNA from tissue in this preserved heart and compare it to DNA from living maternal relatives of Marie Antoinette, descendants of her sisters through the female line. The match is conclusive. The child who died in the temple was indeed Louis Charles, son of Marie Antoinette. The pretenders, the rumors, the conspiracies, all finally put to rest by science. On June 8, 2004, the heart is interred with Louis Roman XVI and Marie Antoinette in St. Denis, the last member of the immediate family to be laid to rest, more than 2 centuries after his death. In the 21st century, Marie Antoinette's image continues to evolve. Feminist historians examine her story through the lens of gender, noting how she was judged by standards applied exclusively to women, criticized for her sexuality, whether real or imagined, for her spending, while male royalties' expenditures went unmentioned, for her political involvement when kings' political decisions were simply expected, for her motherhood, too involved or not involved enough, depending on the critic. The pornographic libels that destroyed her reputation are recognized as a form of political assassination unique to women in power, using sexual degradation as a weapon when legal or military means are unavailable or insufficient. The Marie Antoinette we have inherited is thus multiple. The historical woman who lived and suffered and died, the mythological figure of revolutionary propaganda, the romantic martyr of royalist memory, the symbol of aristocratic excess in popular culture, the human being revealed in letters and documents, the victim of misogyny examined by modern scholars. All of these Marie Antoinettes coexist, and in some ways, the mythological figure is more powerful than the real woman ever was. To understand Marie Antoinette's lasting significance, we must understand the revolution that destroyed her, for she has become inseparable from it. The French Revolution remains one of history's most analyzed, most debated, most consequential events. It began with hope. The Estates General of 1789, the Tennis Court Oath, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the promise of liberty, equality, fraternity. It descended into the Terror, the September massacres, the guillotine working daily, the drownings at Nantes, the crushing of the Vendée Rebellion with genocidal violence, the Revolutionary Tribunal sending thousands to execution. The revolution's body count is staggering and contested. During the Terror alone, perhaps 40,000 official executions. In the Vendée, where Republican armies crushed royalist Catholic rebels, estimates range from tens of thousands to several 100,000 dead. Men, women, children killed in what some historians call the first modern genocide. In the wars that followed, as revolutionary and then Napoleonic France fought all of Europe, millions died. The revolution and its aftermath reshaped Europe, destroyed the old order, established new principles of government and citizenship, and demonstrated that popular sovereignty, once unleashed, could be as tyrannical as any monarch. Was it worth it? The question haunts revolutionary historiography. On one hand, the revolution destroyed feudalism, established legal equality, promoted meritocracy, spread Enlightenment principles across Europe, inspired liberation movements worldwide. The ideals of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, popular sovereignty, human rights, remain foundational to modern democracy. On the other hand, the Terror demonstrated how revolutionary idealism could justify mass murder, how the promise of a better future could excuse present atrocity, how quickly revolutionary liberation becomes revolutionary tyranny. Marie Antoinette becomes, in this debate, a touchstone. For those who see the revolution as necessary and ultimately beneficial, Marie Antoinette represents the old order that had to be swept away. Not perhaps as an individual, her execution is often admitted as excessive, but as a symbol. For those who see the revolution as tragic, as an unnecessary descent into violence that could have been avoided with reform, Marie Antoinette becomes a sympathetic victim, a woman who paid with her life for systemic failures she did not create. For those who see the revolution as complex, containing both liberating and destructive elements, Marie Antoinette is similarly complex, flawed but human, complicit in some ways but ultimately more victim than perpetrator. The let them eat cake myth plays into all of these interpretations. For revolutionary sympathizers, the phrase, even if she didn't say it, represents the mindset of the aristocracy, callous, disconnected, deserving of overthrow. For revolutionary critics, the false attribution of the phrase represents revolutionary propaganda, the lies told to justify violence. For those in the middle, the phrase becomes a metaphor for how revolutions create mythologies that obscure truth, how political movements need villains more than they need accuracy. Why, 2.5 centuries after her birth, does Marie Antoinette remain so present in modern culture? Why do we continue to tell her story, to make films about her, to use her name as shorthand for certain types of privilege and disconnection? The answer lies in what she represents, not who she actually was, but what her story means. Marie Antoinette embodies the beautiful, doomed woman destroyed by forces beyond her control. This is a narrative structure that appears across cultures and centuries. Helen of Troy, Cleopatra, Anne Boleyn. The list extends through history. These women are beautiful, they are powerful or adjacent to power. They are controversial, and they die violently or tragically. Their stories allow us to explore questions about power, gender, sexuality, violence, and justice without confronting these questions in our own contexts. We can debate whether Marie Antoinette deserved her fate without having to face similar questions about people in our own time. She also represents the last gasp of a dying world. Marie Antoinette is the final queen of France before the Revolution, the last person to live the full, unquestioned privilege of absolute monarchy. Everything she represents, inherited power, aristocratic excess, the divine right of kings, the rigid hierarchy of European society, will be destroyed within her lifetime. There is something both fascinating and satisfying about watching this world collapse, about seeing that those who seem untouchable can indeed be touched, that structures that seem permanent can fall. The French Revolution proves that no power is absolute, that people can overthrow even the most entrenched systems. Marie Antoinette's death demonstrates this principle in the most visceral way possible, but she also represents victimhood. Modern audiences, particularly after the extensive historical work of the past century, increasingly see Marie Antoinette as a woman trapped by circumstances. She was married at 14 to a foreign prince she'd never met, sent to a country where she was always seen as an outsider, expected to produce heirs when her husband couldn't or wouldn't consummate the marriage, blamed for spending money when she had no control over national finances, accused of political conspiracies when she had minimal political power, vilified in pornographic propaganda, imprisoned, separated from her children, tried in a show trial, and executed. When we frame her story this way, she becomes sympathetic, a victim of forces, patriarchy, nationalism, revolution, that destroyed her regardless of her actual guilt or innocence. The tension between these views, Marie Antoinette as symbol of deserved revolutionary justice versus Marie Antoinette as innocent victim, is never resolved, and perhaps cannot be resolved. Both contain truth. She was part of a fundamentally unjust system, benefited enormously from it, and bears some responsibility for its continuation. She was also a human being who suffered terribly, who loved her children, who faced death with courage, and whose execution served no practical purpose beyond symbolic revenge. The French Revolution, which destroyed Marie Antoinette, was fundamentally a bourgeois revolution. The rising middle classes, armed with Enlightenment ideas and frustrated by aristocratic privilege, overthrew the old feudal order and established a new society based on legal equality and property rights. This pattern would repeat across Europe and beyond over the following century. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 in France, the unification of Italy and Germany, the gradual extension of voting rights in Britain, the abolition of serfdom in Russia, all reflect the slow death of feudalism and absolute monarchy, the triumph of liberal and nationalist principles over dynastic and aristocratic ones. Marie Antoinette stands at the beginning of this process, the first major royal figure executed by popular revolution. Charles I of England preceded her, but that was a different kind of revolution, less popular and more parliamentary. Her execution demonstrates that monarchy is not sacred, that divine right is fiction, that rulers depend on the consent of the governed even if they don't acknowledge it. This is a revolutionary idea that transforms political thought. The 20th and 21st centuries see the final extinction of European absolute monarchy. The First World War destroys the German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires, executing or exiling their monarchs, establishing republics or constitutional monarchies in their place. The remaining European monarchies, British, Dutch, Belgian, Scandinavian, Spanish, survive by transforming into ceremonial institutions with minimal actual power. The age of kings is over. The age that began with Marie Antoinette's execution is complete. Yet monarchy retains a strange hold on popular imagination. The British royal family generates obsessive media coverage. Royal weddings draw global audiences. When Princess Diana dies in 1997, the outpouring of grief is extraordinary. The parallel to Marie Antoinette is often drawn, beautiful princess destroyed by the constraints and cruelties of royal life, though Diana's death is accident rather than execution. The fascination with royalty persists even as actual royal power disappears, suggesting that something in human nature is drawn to the drama of hereditary privilege, to the beautiful doomed figures at the center of history. The phrase, "let them eat cake," though Marie Antoinette never said it, points to a real and persistent issue: economic inequality and the disconnection between elites and ordinary people's material struggles. This theme runs through all of history, but becomes particularly acute in the modern era of capitalism and democracy, where legal equality coexists with massive economic stratification. The France of 1789 faced a crisis of subsistence. Bread was the staple food for ordinary French people, constituting perhaps half their caloric intake. When harvests failed, bread prices rose, and people starved. The free market in grain, implemented by some reforming ministers in the 1770s and 1780s, was supposed to increase efficiency, but instead led to hoarding, speculation, and price volatility that hurt the poor. The crowds that marched on Versailles in October 1789 were mostly women demanding bread for their families. The revolution's radicalization was driven in part by continued food shortages, which revolutionaries blamed on aristocratic conspiracy and hoarding. The "let them eat cake" myth encapsulates this crisis. If the Queen or any aristocrat could suggest eating cake when bread was unavailable, it demonstrated such profound disconnection from reality that violence seemed justified. The cake eater deserves overthrow because she literally cannot imagine what life is like for ordinary people. This framework, elites disconnected from common suffering, remains politically potent today. Modern political discourse constantly invokes this dynamic. When politicians or wealthy individuals say things that seem tone-deaf to economic struggle, they are accused of let them eat cake moments. When economic inequality reaches extremes, revolutionaries and reformers point to out-of-touch elites as the problem. The actual economics are always more complex. Just as Marie Antoinette's spending didn't cause France's bankruptcy, modern inequality has structural causes beyond individual elite consumption. But the emotional and moral logic remains powerful. Those who benefit from an unjust system bear responsibility for it, even if they didn't create it and don't personally enforce it. Marie Antoinette's story is inseparable from questions of gender. Throughout history, powerful women or women adjacent to power face specific forms of attack unavailable or less effective against men. Sexual slander, accusations of witchcraft, claims of manipulating male relatives, suggestions of inadequate motherhood. These are weapons used against women in ways they are not used against men. The libels against Marie Antoinette are pornographic to a degree rarely seen in propaganda against male rulers. They depict her in orgies with multiple partners, in lesbian affairs with the Princess de Lamballe and others, in incestuous relations with her son, as insatiably sexual, as using her body to manipulate men. These pamphlets serve multiple purposes. They titillate, sexual content always sells. They degrade, reducing a queen to a sexual object destroys her dignity. And they provide justification for her removal. A woman this depraved cannot be allowed to influence the kingdom. Male rulers face different attacks. Louis XVI is criticized for being weak, indecisive, incompetent, perhaps impotent. But he is not depicted in pornographic scenarios the way his wife is. The attack on him questions his ability to rule. The attack on her questions her fundamental morality and humanity. This gender difference in political attack persists into the present. Female politicians face sexual rumors, appearance criticism, and questions about their families in ways male politicians generally do not. The trial of Marie Antoinette demonstrates this most clearly. The incest accusation, Hebert's claim that she sexually abused her son, has no evidentiary basis whatsoever. It appears to come from confused testimony extracted from young Louis Charles under psychological pressure, and even revolutionary officials recognize it as excessive. Yet it is introduced at trial, because it is the ultimate degradation, the accusation that places Marie Antoinette beyond all human sympathy. A woman who would sexually abuse her child is a monster, and monsters can be killed without remorse. Marie Antoinette's appeal to the mothers in the courtroom. Nature itself recoils at such an accusation against a mother, is one of the few moments in her trial where she breaks through the revolutionary narrative and speaks human to human. Even the hardened tricotuses are moved because motherhood is sacred in 18th century culture, and suggesting a mother would harm her child violates deep taboos. The moment passes, the revolutionary machinery continues, but that flash of common humanity reveals the cruelty of what is being done. Modern feminist scholarship has reclaimed Marie Antoinette as a subject, examining how she was destroyed by misogynistic propaganda, how she was held to impossible standards, how her story illustrates the specific vulnerabilities of women in power. This scholarship doesn't excuse her participation in an unjust system, but it contextualizes her story within larger patterns of how societies treat powerful women. We return finally to where we began, the lie. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette never said it, yet the phrase is inseparable from her name, more famous than anything she actually said or did. This should trouble us. It reveals how historical memory works, how myths become more powerful than facts, how useful lies displace inconvenient truths. The persistence of the let them eat cake myth, despite 2 centuries of historians pointing out its falsity, tells us something about how history functions in popular consciousness. Most people do not read academic history. They encounter the past through school textbooks, popular biographies, films, novels, casual conversation. In these contexts, memorable stories matter more than documented facts. A vivid anecdote, even if false, shapes understanding more effectively than careful archival research. This creates a problem for historians and for democratic citizenship. If people's understanding of the past is based on myths, their ability to learn from history is compromised. The French Revolution is one of the foundational events of modernity, essential to understanding democracy, nationalism, human rights, totalitarianism, all the forces that shape our world. If people's understanding of the revolution is based on false stories about Marie Antoinette eating cake, they miss the actual causes of revolutionary crisis: fiscal collapse, administrative paralysis, social inequality, political deadlock, military defeat, harvest failure. They miss the complexity of how societies fail and how revolutions unfold. But myths serve purposes that facts do not. The let them eat cake myth teaches a moral lesson about empathy, about the dangers of elite disconnection from common suffering. It's a parable, and parables convey truth even when the specific story is fiction. In this sense, defenders of the myth might argue that it doesn't matter whether Marie Antoinette actually said it. The phrase represents a real phenomenon, a real type of aristocratic callousness that existed in 18th century France and exists in various forms today. Yet this defense is insufficient. Teaching lies, even useful lies, corrodes epistemological standards. It trains people to accept vivid stories without demanding evidence. It privileges emotional resonance over factual accuracy. In an age of misinformation, of fake news, of social media, enabling the rapid spread of false but compelling narratives, the distinction between useful myth and dangerous lie becomes harder to maintain. The case of Marie Antoinette and the cake should thus serve as a lesson in historical skepticism. When we encounter a story that perfectly confirms our pre-existing beliefs, about aristocrats, about elites, about any group we're predisposed to dislike, we should pause and ask, is this actually true? Or is this too perfect, too neat, too ideologically convenient? The stories that confirm our biases are precisely the ones we should scrutinize most carefully. In the end, after all the historical analysis, all the political interpretation, all the myth-making and myth-breaking, Marie Antoinette was a human being. She was born an archduchess in Vienna, a child of the Enlightenment's most powerful dynasty. She was sent to France as an instrument of diplomacy, expected to cement an alliance through her body, through marriage, through childbearing, through the merging of bloodlines. She tried to fulfill these expectations and failed for 7 years, suffering humiliation and isolation. When she finally succeeded in producing children, she loved them with fierce maternal devotion. When crisis came, she tried to protect her family, using the limited means available to her. When revolution destroyed her world, she faced imprisonment and death with remarkable courage. She made mistakes. She spent extravagantly when fiscal restraint would have been wiser. She involved herself in politics she didn't fully understand. She maintained loyalty to Austria when such loyalty fed French suspicions. She was haughty and sometimes callous in ways that fed her enemies' propaganda. But these were human failings, understandable given her youth, her limited education, her impassable position. They do not justify the viciousness of the campaign against her or the cruelty of her death. The letters she wrote to her mother, to her friends, to her children, reveal a woman far more complex than either the villainous of revolutionary propaganda or the martyr of royalist memory. She could be loving and petty, generous and vindictive, brave and frightened, dignified and frivolous. She contained multitudes, as all humans do. Reducing her to a symbol, whether of aristocratic excess or royal victimhood, erases this humanity. Her final letter, written in the conciergerie the night before her execution, addressed to Madame Elizabeth but never delivered, shows her at her most human. She writes of her love for her children, her hope that they will forgive any wrongs she may have done them, her desire that they remember her with love. She writes of her Catholic faith, her belief that she will soon be reunited with her husband in death. She forgives her enemies, echoing Christ's words from the cross. She proclaims her innocence of the crimes for which she is condemned, but accepts her death as God's will. It is the letter of a woman facing death, trying to make sense of her life, hoping to leave something behind for those she loves. This woman, frightened, faithful, loving, dying, is the real Marie Antoinette, not the monster of revolutionary imagination or the saint of royalist devotion. She was a person, flawed and finite, who suffered greatly and died violently. Whatever we think of the system she represented, whatever we believe about the justice or injustice of the revolution, she deserves to be remembered as a human being rather than a symbol. The story of Marie Antoinette does not end the revolution's violence. In many ways, her execution marks its acceleration. After the king and queen are dead, the terror intensifies. The revolutionaries who sent Marie Antoinette to the guillotine soon follow her. The Girondins, moderate Republicans who opposed executing the king until forced to accept it, are purged in June 1793. 21 leading Girondins are guillotined in October 1793, just days before Marie Antoinette's execution. More follow in the coming months. Danton, one of the revolution's most powerful figures, the man whose voice supposedly saved the revolution in its darkest hours, grows weary of the terror and begins to call for moderation. In April 1794, he and his followers are arrested, tried, and guillotined. Hebert, the journalist who leveled the incest accusation at Marie Antoinette, is guillotined in March 1794 after his faction's attempted insurrection fails. Even Robespierre, the incorruptible revolutionary, the man who more than anyone else embodies the terror, falls in July 1794. Arrested after losing control of the convention, he is executed along with his closest associates, his jaw shattered from a bullet wound, unable even to speak before the blade falls. The phrase, "the revolution devours its children," becomes a cliché, but it describes a real pattern. Revolutionary movements, particularly those based on ideological purity, inevitably turn on their own members. There is always someone more radical, always a new definition of insufficient revolutionary zeal, always another enemy to purge. Marie Antoinette, as the symbol of the old order, was the easy target. But once she was dead, once all the aristocrats were executed or fled, the revolution needed new enemies and found them within its own ranks. This pattern repeats across revolutionary history. The Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, all feature waves of purges where revolutionaries execute each other in the name of ideological purity. The French Revolution is the template, the first time the pattern manifests clearly in the modern world, and Marie Antoinette's execution is an early step on this path, demonstrating that violence, once legitimized, is difficult to contain. In the centuries since Marie Antoinette's death, France has struggled with how to remember her and the revolution that killed her. The Basilica of Saint Denis, where she and Louis XVI were reinterred in 1815, becomes a site of pilgrimage for monarchists and a point of controversy for republicans. Different French regimes emphasize different aspects of the revolution. The monarchy prefers to remember the constitutional monarchy of 1789, 1792, and forget the terror. Republicans celebrate 1789, but are ambivalent about 1793, 1794. Socialists claim the radical Jacobins as precursors, even while acknowledging the terror's excesses. The question of Marie Antoinette becomes a proxy for these larger debates. Is she a martyr or a symbol of deserved revolutionary justice? The answer depends on what you believe about the revolution itself. This makes historical commemoration politically fraught. The bicentennial of the revolution in 1989 sparks intense debate in France. How do you celebrate an event that produced both the declaration of the rights of man and the terror? François Mitterrand's government tries to thread the needle, celebrating the revolution's ideals while acknowledging its violence, but pleases no one entirely. Marie Antoinette's image appears everywhere in this commemorative moment. Books, films, exhibitions, debates. She is analyzed from every angle, as woman, as queen, as victim, as symbol. The conciergerie where she spent her final days is now a museum where tourists can see the cell where she was held or a reconstruction of it. The original was modified. The temple where her family was imprisoned was demolished in 1808 by Napoleon, who feared it becoming a royalist shrine, but a memorial marker indicates its former location. The Place de la Révolution, where she was executed, is now the Place de la Concorde, and no marker indicates where the guillotine stood. France prefers not to memorialize executions. This selective memory reveals discomfort with revolutionary violence, even as France celebrates revolutionary ideals. The revolution gave France its national motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and established principles that remain foundational to French identity. But it also produced mass murder in the name of virtue, pioneered totalitarian methods of social control, and demonstrated how utopian idealism can justify atrocity. Marie Antoinette's execution embodies this contradiction. Was it justice or murder? The answer remains contested. We have journeyed through centuries, from the Habsburg court of Maria Theresa to the revolutionary Paris of 1793, from the gilded halls of Versailles to the stone cell of the conciergerie. We have seen a girl become a queen become a prisoner become a symbol. We have examined the myths and the reality, the propaganda and the truth, the woman and the legend. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." This is historical fact, documented and verified, but the phrase remains attached to her name because it serves a purpose. It encapsulates a larger truth about aristocratic disconnection from common suffering, about the dangers of inherited privilege, about why the French Revolution happened. The myth is useful, and useful myths are difficult to dislodge even when they are demonstrably false. Yet insisting on the truth matters. Marie Antoinette was not the monster of revolutionary propaganda. She was not a saint either. She was a human being caught in circumstances beyond her control, a woman who made mistakes but also showed courage, who loved her children, who faced death with dignity. She deserves to be remembered as she was, not as legend has made her. The real lesson of Marie Antoinette's story is not about cake or bread or aristocratic indifference. It is about scapegoating, about how societies in crisis search for simple explanations and simple villains, about how propaganda can transform a person into a symbol and then destroy that symbol in the name of justice. It is about how gender shapes historical memory, how powerful women are attacked differently than powerful men. It is about how myths persist and why historical truth matters even when it is less satisfying than legend. 2 centuries after her death, Marie Antoinette remains a presence in our culture, her name invoked, her image reproduced, her story retold. She endures not because of what she did, but because of what she represents. The beautiful doomed woman, the last Queen of France, the symbol of an old world destroyed by revolution, the victim of forces beyond her control, the human being beneath the crown. She never said, "Let them eat cake." But she lived, she suffered, she loved, and she died with courage. That is her true story, more complex and more human than any myth. And it is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth getting right, because truth matters even, especially, when lies are more convenient. The guillotine fell on October 16, 1793, and Marie Antoinette's earthly story ended. But her legend, complicated and contested, continues. May we remember her with accuracy, with compassion, and with understanding of the complex times that destroyed her. May we learn from her story without needing to distort it. May we honor the dead by telling the truth about their lives. This is the entire history of Marie Antoinette and the lie that defines her. This is the woman who never said it.